The first time I realized my parents had scheduled my grandmother's life like a delivery slot was the morning my mother arrived with a suitcase that did not belong to us. It was 2 days after my grandfather's funeral. My daughter was still in unicorn pajamas, eating dry cereal at the kitchen counter, and my grandmother was in the guest room folding one of my old cardigans the way she folded everything when she was anxious: neat corners, careful hands, no wasted motion. Then I heard my father's car door slam outside, followed by my mother's heels on the walkway. They came in without knocking. My mother was carrying that small navy suitcase, already packed. My father said, almost cheerfully, "Good, you're all up. We need to leave in 10 minutes." I remember wiping my hands on a dish towel and asking, "Leave for what?" He looked at me like I was the one being difficult. "For Meadow Glen. We got your grandmother a room." He said it the way someone would say they'd finally found a reliable plumber. My grandmother stepped out of the hallway at that exact moment, and I watched the confusion cross her face before the fear did. That was the worst part. Not outrage, not tears. Confusion. The kind that strips a person of dignity before anyone has even touched them. My mother moved toward her in that soft, polished voice she used in boutiques and church foyers. "Just to take a look, Eleanor. It's a lovely place. Activities, nurses, all the help you need." My grandmother looked at the suitcase, then at me. "Am I going somewhere?" My father answered before I could. "Temporarily. Until we figure out a better arrangement." My 6-year-old daughter, Lucy, slid off her stool and came to stand beside me. She put one hand around my leg and looked up at her great-grandmother. "Are you coming back for dinner?" Nobody answered her. That told me more than a suitcase did. I was 34 then. I taught 3rd grade at a public elementary school in Riverside. My husband, Daniel, managed maintenance for a hotel off the freeway. Between us, we made enough to survive respectably and worry constantly. We rented a narrow 3-bedroom house with thin walls, a dead patch in the backyard, and a kitchen drawer that only opened if you lifted it first. For nearly 2 years, that house had held 5 people without complaint from anyone except the plumbing. My grandparents had moved in with us after my grandfather's heart gave out the first time. He recovered, then declined slowly, the way old men sometimes do, in measured losses. Stairs became impossible. Showers needed supervision. Medication times multiplied. My grandmother, who had once run a home, a church kitchen, and 3 children with one calm voice, could not safely handle his care alone anymore. My parents had options. That was what made everything uglier. My father owned a commercial roofing company. My mother never worked longer than she wanted to. They lived 25 minutes away in a 2-story house with a downstairs office, a formal dining room no one used, and a backyard pool that glittered behind a locked gate. My younger brother lived in Orange County with his wife in a place with a guest suite bigger than my daughter's room. Everyone had space. Everyone had money. What they did not have, apparently, was inconvenience to spare. So my grandparents came to us. Lucy gave up her bedroom before anyone asked her to. She was 4 years old and solemn about it, dragging her stuffed rabbit into the den while Daniel moved her little bed under the window. She said, "Nana needs a real room because she's old, and old people get tired faster." She said it like weather, like fact, not sacrifice. My grandfather cried the first week they were with us, though he tried not to let me see it. Not from pain, from shame. He had been a machinist for 39 years, the kind of man who sharpened pencils with a knife and still wrote checks in block print. Needing help humiliated him. My husband handled that better than anyone. He installed grab bars in the bathroom and a ramp over the back step. He figured out how to brace my grandfather under the elbow without making it feel like lifting. Every morning before work, he made coffee strong enough to wake the dead and sat with him at the kitchen table for 10 quiet minutes while the rest of us slept. That became our life. I handled doctor appointments, pharmacy calls, Medicare forms, meal schedules, and the 1,000 invisible tasks that come with keeping fragile people safe. My grandmother cooked when she had the energy. My grandfather watched Lucy after school from his recliner and taught her checkers and card games and how to say thank you like you meant it. Our house was crowded and tired and sometimes smelled faintly of ointment and soup, but it was alive. It felt honest. My parents liked to visit just often enough to remain innocent. My mother brought supermarket flowers and commented on how admirable I was. My father stood in the kitchen with his hands on his hips and asked practical questions about medications and mobility and insurance coverage in the tone of a man reviewing a subcontractor's estimate. My brother came by for birthdays, once for Easter, and one Sunday in July when he spent 20 minutes describing traffic before leaving early because he had tea times the next morning. Not one of them ever said, "We'll take next week." Instead, they praised me the way people praise volunteers, generously, from a safe distance. The first thing that lodged in my mind happened the previous Thanksgiving. My mother was rinsing dishes beside me after dinner while my grandmother rested in the den. She lowered her voice and said, "You've done enough, Elena. At some point there are places designed for this." I said, "Designed for what?" She dried her hands and shrugged. "For the end stages." I remember how neatly she said it. End stages. Like inventory language. Like an expiration problem. My grandfather heard her. I knew he had because later that night, when I brought him his pills, he asked, "Your mother thinks in rooms and exits, doesn't she?" I laughed a little because I thought he was being dry. He wasn't. He was taking note. The second thing happened in February, after his cardiologist confirmed what we had all begun to suspect. His heart was failing faster than they'd hoped. There would be medication changes, more monitoring, maybe 6 months, maybe a year, depending on luck and compliance and things medicine could not promise. He was unusually quiet on the drive home from the appointment. My grandmother had stayed back with Lucy, and for once it was just the two of us in my car. At a red light, he said, "Don't tell your father what the doctor said yet." I glanced over. Why not? He was looking out the window, watching a shopping cart wobble across a parking lot in the wind. Because some people start measuring drapes the minute they hear a man is dying. I should have asked what he meant. I didn't. I thought he was grieving in advance. I thought he wanted privacy. I did not understand that he had already seen enough to know what was coming. In March, he asked me to drive him downtown for an appointment. He wore his good gray sweater and combed his hair with more care than usual. When I asked where we were going, he said, to put some things in order. That was all. The office turned out to be on the second floor of an old brick building with a brass directory in the lobby. Brunner, Cole and Whitman, Estate Law. I stayed in the waiting room with a stale cup of coffee and a school folder full of spelling tests while he was inside for more than an hour. When he came out, he looked tired, but not upset. Resolved. There is a difference. He held the elevator rail all the way down and told me, "Thank you, sweetheart," in the same voice he used when someone had completed a difficult chore correctly. A few weeks later, he asked me to take him to a notary. That day I did notice more. The stack of papers was thick. There were signature tabs. My grandfather read every page with his glasses low on his nose. My grandmother signed too, though only after he explained each section to her in slow, patient language. I remember one phrase because it sounded formal and important enough to stay with me: durable power of attorney. Another was healthcare directive. There was something about successor authority. There was a date stamp in purple ink and a notary with careful lipstick who watched each signature as if it mattered, which apparently it did. I asked him in the parking lot if everything was all right. He smiled at me, and I can still hear the roughness in his breathing. "I'm not planning to die this week, Elena. I'm planning to make other people behave after I do." It should have startled me more than it did. By summer, his body had started shrinking around his stubbornness. He ate less, slept more. Some afternoons he drifted in and out of naps in the den while cartoons played low for Lucy in the living room. My father increased his visits, which at first I took as guilt finally doing something useful. He began bringing brochures. Independent living. Assisted living. Memory care communities with landscaped courtyards and smiling women in pastel cardigans. My grandfather never argued when my father was there. He just watched. One Sunday in July, I walked back into the house from hanging laundry and heard my father in the kitchen on his phone. His voice had that smooth business cadence he used when he wanted things to go his way. I only caught a piece of it. "No, late fall would be more realistic," he said. "We'll need a place that can transition her easily once he's gone." He turned when he saw me. He smiled too quickly and ended the call. At work? I asked. Something like that, he said. I stood there a second too long, clothespins still in my hand. I remember the smell of detergent and hot concrete from the patio. I remember feeling that some line had shifted under my feet even though I could not yet see where. That night after everyone was asleep, I found my grandfather awake in the den, sitting in the dark except for the television glow. He asked me, "Was your father here long?" I said yes. He nodded, but he did not ask anything else. He already knew enough. The third incident happened in August. My mother thought my grandfather was asleep in his recliner while she sat at my table drinking iced tea and talking to my brother on speakerphone. I was in the hallway gathering towels. She said, "Once your father's gone, we have to simplify things quickly. Your grandmother can't manage the property. Elena certainly can't. We'll sell the house, put the funds where they belong, and move her somewhere decent. Where they belong. Not where she wanted. Not where he had planned. Where they belong." I stood in the hallway so still my hand cramped around the towels. Then my grandfather coughed, loudly, from the den. My mother's voice changed instantly. Softer. "I should go check on Dad," she said, and the call ended. After she left, he asked me to bring him tea. When I handed it to him, he said, "Your mother likes to count money before the room is empty." It was the closest he ever came to speaking badly of his own children in front of me. That alone should have told me how serious he was. In October, about a month before he died, he called me into the den while Lucy and Daniel were in the backyard and my grandmother was napping. He had a large manila envelope on his lap, sealed with clear packing tape. My name was written across the front in his handwriting. He held it out to me and said, "Put this somewhere safe. Do not open it now." I sat beside him and took it. It was heavier than I expected. "What is it?" "Instructions." "For what?" He looked toward the hallway to make sure we were alone. "For when they decide to be practical." That word again. Practical. Every time my parents used it, someone else lost something. I tried to joke because I was scared. "You're making me nervous." "You should be," he said, not unkindly. "But not because of what's in that envelope. Because of what it means that I had to make it." I asked if I should tell Daniel. He said yes. I asked if my grandmother knew. He said enough. Then he put his hand over mine and said something I have replayed in my head more times than I can count. Being loved by the right person can protect you. Being related to the wrong one cannot. Then he made me promise. Not casually. Not grandly. Calmly. He made me repeat it back to him. I promised I would keep it sealed until I needed it. He died on a Thursday before dawn, in his sleep, with one hand above the blanket like he had only meant to rest a moment. I found my grandmother sitting beside him in her nightgown, dry-eyed with shock, one hand on his wrist as if she still expected a pulse to correct itself. My father took over within an hour. Funeral home. Church. Flowers. Military honors because my grandfather had served in Korea and never spoke of it unless someone else brought it up first. At the service, my father delivered a polished eulogy about sacrifice, family, steadiness, old-school values. He sounded convincing. That was the problem. My mother cried carefully. My brother shook hands and looked solemn. People told me my parents were being strong. Meanwhile, my grandmother sat with both hands folded around a tissue she never used, and when the crowd thinned after the burial, she whispered to me, "I don't know where I'm supposed to be now." I said, with me. At the time, I meant it emotionally. I didn't know I would have to mean it legally. The day after the funeral, my father showed up with forms. He did not lead with the nursing home. He led with concern. He always did. "This can't go on indefinitely," he said, standing in my kitchen while my mother arranged untouched muffins on a plate no one had asked for. "You have a child. You work full-time. Mom's needs are only going to increase." "She's not an emergency," I said. "She's vulnerable," my mother corrected, as if that were nobler. I told them we would talk later, not now. My father's mouth flattened in that thin line I knew from childhood, the expression that meant he believed patience was a favor he might revoke. Then came the next morning. The suitcase. The 10-minute warning. My grandmother's face. Lucy's question. I said, "She's not going anywhere today." My father gave me a look I had not seen since I was 16 and refused to quit art classes to help in his office that summer. This isn't a debate. My husband had already left for work. That mattered. My parents had chosen a morning they knew he would be gone. They did not want resistance. They wanted momentum. My mother touched my grandmother's elbow. Let's just go see the place. My grandmother did not move. She looked at me and asked, very quietly, do I have to? That was the moment the room changed for me. Up until then, I had still been treating this as family overreach, bad judgment, premature planning. But that question turned it into something else. They were not offering. They were transferring. They had decided her life for her and were asking her to cooperate with her own removal. Lucy started crying before I did. Not loud, just tears running down her face in clean lines. She wrapped her arms around my grandmother's waist and said, "You can keep my room. I like the den." My father exhaled, irritated now. "Don't make this dramatic." I looked at him for a long second, then went to my bedroom. The envelope was in the bottom drawer under winter sweaters and an old box of tax papers. I had not touched it since October except to move it once when I was looking for wrapping tape. When I picked it up, I felt something hard inside besides paper. A key maybe, or a flash drive. My hands were steady, which surprised me. I came back into the hallway with the envelope tucked under my arm. My father was guiding my grandmother toward the front door. My mother had the suitcase. Lucy was still crying. I heard myself say, "I'm coming." "Not necessary," my father said. It wasn't a request. The drive to Meadow Glen took 22 minutes. I know because I watched the clock change while I followed their SUV. My grandmother sat in the back seat of their car. I could see the pale blur of her hair through the rear glass every time we stopped at a light. Lucy sat in my passenger seat holding my phone because I had handed it to her without thinking. At one point she asked, "Is Nana in trouble?" And I told her no, though by then I knew someone was. Meadow Glen was one of those new private facilities built to reassure adult children with money. Neutral stone entrance. Potted plants flanking automatic doors. A lobby arranged like a hotel nobody actually wanted to sleep in. It smelled of lemon cleanser and artificial vanilla. The admissions director met us with a practiced smile and a clipboard. My father shook her hand as if this were a business closing. My grandmother sat in a beige armchair near the window. The suitcase was placed neatly beside her feet. That image still makes me sick. A whole life reduced to one carry-on bag and a chair in a lobby. The woman from admissions crouched slightly in front of her. "Mrs. Marquez, we're so happy to have you with us." My grandmother looked down at her own hands. Then she asked, in a voice so thin I nearly missed it, "Was I too much trouble?" My father kept signing. That was when I opened the envelope. Not dramatically. Not all at once. I set it on a side table, pulled at the tape, and slid the contents into my hands while the lobby buzzed quietly around us. The first thing I saw was a cover letter on law office stationery. Beneath that, notarized documents. A trust certification. Durable financial power of attorney. Advanced healthcare directive. County recording copies. My own name appeared over and over, not as beneficiary, but as agent, successor, co-owner, authorized decision-maker. For a second, I could hear nothing except the blood in my ears. Then the admissions director noticed my face and asked, "Is there a problem?" I looked up and said, with a calm I did not feel, "Yes, there is." My father turned at the sound of my voice. The pen stopped in his hand. I read the top page once more to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding it. I wasn't. Then I looked at him across that polished lobby, with my grandmother still sitting there in her blue cardigan and my daughter clutching my sleeve, and I said, "You can stop filling that out." He stared at me. "Excuse me?" I lifted the document so he could see the seal and my name. No one can admit her without my consent. For 1 second, nobody moved. The admissions director took the papers from me with both hands and did what competent people do when rich relatives try to create urgency. She slowed down. She read the header, then the signature block, then the notary seal, then the second page. Her expression did not change much, but her posture did. She stood up straighter and turned slightly away from my father. He recovered first. "That means nothing," he said. "I'm her son." The director kept reading. It may mean quite a lot, sir. My mother stepped in then, still trying to sound reasonable. My father-in-law was very ill toward the end. Elena doesn't understand the context. I understand enough, I said. I took the papers back and read out the lines that mattered. My grandfather had named me my grandmother's healthcare agent. He had named me financial agent under a durable power of attorney. The trust documents gave me authority over specific assets for my grandmother's benefit. There was also a certified copy of a recorded property transfer on my grandparents' house. My grandfather had not left things vague. He had not trusted goodwill. He had used signatures, dates, stamps, witnesses, and recorded filings. He had built exactly the kind of structure my father respected only when it benefited him. The admissions director asked if she could make copies. I said yes. My father finally put the pen down. This is absurd. Dad was medicated. He didn't know what he was signing. There it was. The challenge my grandfather had anticipated. I pulled the next document from the envelope. A physician's letter from my grandfather's cardiologist, dated 4 days before the estate meeting, affirming that he was oriented, capable of understanding his decisions, and competent to manage his legal affairs. Attached to it was a memo from the law office noting that they had met with him privately, confirmed his wishes independently, and documented capacity concerns specifically because he feared future disputes from family members. The admissions director looked from the memo to my father. "Sir, we cannot proceed." He said, "You can and you will." She did not raise her voice. "No, we won't." That was the moment his face changed. The pleasant, managerial tone fell off him like a dropped coat. I had seen that face before with subcontractors, waiters, and once when my brother backed his truck into the mailbox and my father said, with terrible calm, "Do you think consequences are optional for you?" Now it was on me. "You've manipulated this whole situation," he said. "She's vulnerable and you've been in that house controlling access for years." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so cleanly dishonest. He had visited maybe once a month. My mother less. They knew how much care my grandparents needed because I had been the one giving it. I said, "You brought a suitcase for a woman you never asked." My grandmother was watching us with the frightened stillness of someone trapped inside other people's decisions. I turned away from my father and knelt beside her. "You don't have to stay here," I told her. "You can come home with me." She blinked up at me, trying to understand whether this was really true. "I can." "Yes." My daughter wiped her nose with the back of her hand and said, "I told you." That nearly broke me. I stood up and asked the director for the copies. She handed them over, along with the incomplete intake packet she had quietly taken back from my father. Then she looked directly at my grandmother and said, very gently, "Mrs. Marquez, we will not admit you today." My father stepped toward me in the parking lot when we left. He caught my elbow hard enough to make his point. "You have no idea what you're doing." I pulled my arm free. "I know exactly what you were doing." He looked at the envelope in my hand. "What else did he give you?" That question told me more than any confession would have. Not grief. Not concern. Inventory. I opened the rear door for my grandmother. Lucy climbed in beside her and buckled herself without being told. My mother stood on the curb near the suitcase, suddenly uncertain whether to keep pretending this was all for the best. Then my father said the thing he should never have said. "If you make this ugly, Elena, don't expect this family to forgive you." I looked at him across that expensive parking lot in his pressed shirt and polished shoes, standing outside a place where he had nearly left his mother with a suitcase and a brochure. "I'm not the one who needs forgiveness," I said. I drove home with my grandmother in the back seat holding Lucy's hand the entire way. That night, after my husband got home and Lucy was asleep and my grandmother had finally eaten a little soup and gone to bed, I opened the rest of the envelope at the kitchen table. The first layer was authority. The second was proof. There were bank statements, 3 years of them, with specific withdrawals highlighted in yellow. Next to several of them, my grandfather had written notes in his careful block print. Loan to Carlos for roofing payroll. Advance to Teresa for boutique lease. Cashier's check for Matthew and wedding expenses. Short-term help never repaid. Promised return after property refinance. No return. I added them twice because I did not trust my anger to count accurately. The total was $123,000. That number sat between me and my husband like a third person. We had spent 2 years juggling grocery lists, overtime, school expenses, prescriptions, and copays while my parents and brother had quietly drained my grandparents for 6 figures and then called a nursing home practical. There was more. Copies of checks, a handwritten ledger page, notes about conversations, dates, who asked for what excuse they used, whether repayment had ever come. Then, at the bottom, was a letter addressed to me. It was 6 pages, written in blue ink, neat and deliberate, with none of the confusion my father was already trying to invent. My grandfather began by anchoring himself in time. The exact date, the weather that morning, Lucy losing her second front tooth the week before, my anniversary, my husband's truck needing front brakes, the name of the neighbor's dog that barked at the mailman every day around 2. It was a defense written by a man who understood exactly how memory would be attacked after death. Then he told me what he had heard. He wrote that in July he had overheard my father on the phone reserving a late fall placement because once Dad passes, we need to transition Mom quickly before Elena gets sentimental. He wrote that in August my mother told my brother the house would finally be liquid again once my grandmother was settled somewhere supervised. He wrote that in September my father sat by his chair and told him, with false kindness, that living with us was unfair to me and bad for Lucy, and that good daughters know when to hand things over to professionals. My grandfather wrote, in the middle of the 4th page, a sentence that made me put the letter down for a moment because I could no longer see clearly. Your father confuses expense with sacrifice. He thinks paying is the same as caring. Then came the part he had prepared most carefully. He explained each legal step he had taken. The trust for my grandmother's support, the powers of attorney, the property transfer, the capacity documentation. He named the attorney. He named the notary. He noted dates and why each step mattered. He wrote that he had chosen me not because I was the oldest or the most successful, but because I had made room without being asked and protected dignity without announcing it. At the very end, he wrote, if they force the issue, do not argue about feelings. Use paper. Paper is the only language some people truly respect. My husband read that line over my shoulder and let out one slow breath. He knew your father too well. I called the attorney the next morning from my car before school. He knew my name before I finished saying it. My grandfather had told him I would eventually call and that when I did, it would mean events had unfolded exactly as expected. I told him about Meadow Glen. I told him about my father's threat to contest. I told him what I had found in the envelope. He listened, then said, your grandfather was thorough. If your father challenges capacity, we have contemporaneous medical documentation, attorney notes, and execution formalities across multiple dates. If he claims undue influence, the facts cut the other way. Your grandfather initiated the planning privately, and your parents' financial history gives him a clear reason. I asked him what that meant for the money. He said, potentially quite a lot. He explained it plainly. The records my grandfather kept were enough to support a serious claim that my parents and brother had financially exploited an elder adult, especially if the funds had been obtained through pressure, dependency, or misuse of trust. Some of the transfers might be argued as gifts. Others were labeled loans. Some had supporting notes. What mattered most was the pattern and the timing. If my father tried to drag this into probate litigation or challenge the trust, the attorney could respond not just defensively, but offensively. He said, if they push, we can seek an accounting and repayment. And once discovery starts, people who live by appearances tend to become very interested in settlement. That same afternoon, my father called 4 times. My mother twice. My brother once, for the first time in weeks. I answered none of them. Then my mother showed up. She came alone, wearing a cream blouse and sunglasses, and an expression that suggested she had practiced in the mirror. My grandmother was napping. Lucy was still at school. My husband was at work. My mother knew the quiet windows in my life because she had always expected access to them. She sat at my kitchen table without being invited and said, we need to stop this before your father does something proud. That was how she framed it. Not before he hurts your grandmother. Before he does something proud. I stood by the sink and waited. She slid an envelope across the table. Inside was a cashier's check for $50,000. No one wants a legal fight, she said. You keep your grandmother. You keep whatever paperwork Dad signed. We all move on. In return, you signed something saying there was no coercion, no abuse, no claim. I looked at the amount, then at her. Did you really think this would work? Her face tightened. I think you have a child, Elena. I think you rent. I think $50,000 could change your life. That was the only honest thing she said. For one split second, she was right. $50,000 could have changed my life. It could have cleared debt, replaced the truck, started a down payment fund, bought breathing room. That was what made the moment so ugly. She was offering relief in exchange for silence about what they had done to the people who made her own comfort possible. I tore the check in half, then again. She stared at the pieces on the table and the softness left her completely. You are enjoying this far too much, she said. No, I said. I'm just no longer protecting you from yourselves. She stood up so abruptly the chair leg scraped. At the doorway she turned and said, Thanksgiving is tomorrow. Your father expects you. I said, then your father should prepare to be disappointed. But by evening, my grandmother surprised me. She was sitting in the den with Lucy, helping her sort crayons by color, when she asked, Is your father hosting tomorrow? I said yes. She was quiet a moment. Your grandfather hated scenes. I don't. But I hate lies more. I think I should go. I looked at her carefully. Are you sure? She nodded once. I'm tired of being discussed in rooms I'm standing in. So we went. My parents hosted Thanksgiving every year like a performance review disguised as a holiday. There were assigned serving dishes, polished glasses, centerpieces, iron napkins, and enough food to prove abundance to people who were not hungry. My brother and his wife were already there when we arrived. My mother's sister and uncle came too, along with two cousins who had no idea they were about to witness the end of one family myth and the beginning of a much quieter truth. When we walked in, the room shifted. Not dramatically, just enough. My grandmother was on my arm. Lucy held my husband's hand. My father set down his wine glass and stared like he had seen a ghost arrive with counsel. My mother recovered first. Mom, we didn't know if you felt up to it. My grandmother said, that's because you stopped asking me things. No one knew where to put that sentence. Dinner was strained from the beginning. My father tried to operate above it. He carved the turkey. He asked my husband about work. He complimented the roles. He did what men do when they believe control can be reassembled through ritual. Then, halfway through the meal, he set down his knife and fork and said, I think before this gets any worse, Elena should explain to the family why she's chosen to turn grief into litigation. My brother looked at me with that tired, superior disappointment he had worn since college, as if adulthood had happened to him more elegantly than to me. My mother folded her napkin. My aunt looked between us and suddenly became very interested in her plate. I put down my water glass. I'm happy to explain, I said. My father leaned back, almost relieved. He thought he was about to manage the room. I did not start with the law. My grandfather had told me not to argue about feelings, but I understood something else too. Before paper mattered, the room needed to remember the human being they had nearly erased. So I began with a suitcase. I said that 2 days after burying her husband, my grandmother was taken to a facility she had not asked to see, with a room already arranged, intake forms half completed, and clothing packed in advance. I said she had sat in the lobby and asked whether she had become a burden. My aunt's face changed at that. She looked sharply at my mother. My father cut in. That's a manipulative retelling. I ignored him and moved to the first layer of proof. I described the powers of attorney, the healthcare directive, the trust documents, and the attorney-prepared capacity records. I laid copies on the table, one by one. Not a stack thrown in anger. A careful placement. Date. Signature. Notary seal. Medical letter. Recorded property transfer. My father's color started to go. My brother said, Dad, what is this? My father snapped. It's paperwork signed by a dying man under influence. That was when I placed my grandfather's letter on the table, but kept my hand on it. No, I said. It's paperwork signed by a man who knew exactly what you were planning. The room went still. I read only the necessary parts. Not the tender lines. Not what he wrote about Lucy. Not the sentences that belonged to me. I read the dates and the observations. The July phone call about late fall placement. My mother discussing how the house would be liquid again once my grandmother was settled. My father telling my grandfather he was becoming too much for us. The line about some people measuring drapes the minute a man is dying. My uncle whispered, Jesus. My mother said, too quickly, that could mean anything. Then I moved to the second layer. The one my father had not expected me to use in front of witnesses. I put the bank statements and ledger copies on the table. These are the transfers Grandpa documented. To you. To Mom. To Matthew. $123,000 over 3 years. Loans, advances, temporary help, and wedding expenses. Show me where any of it was repaid. My brother went white first. I paid some back. I looked at him. Then bring the records. He had none with him, of course, because liars rarely prepare for documents at dinner. My father slammed his palm against the table. This is disgusting. You're ambushing family over private matters. My grandmother, who had said almost nothing all evening, lifted her head. Private, she asked. Everyone turned to her. Her voice was not loud, but it was perfectly clear. You took money from my husband while telling yourselves it was temporary. You waited for him to die so you could put me away. Then you tried to move me out before the flowers from his funeral were gone. And now private is the word you choose. I have never heard a room empty of pretense so fast. My mother began to cry, but this time no one rushed to comfort her. My aunt looked sick. My uncle stared at my father like he was seeing him for the first time. My brother muttered something about misunderstandings and pressure and business liquidity, but even he heard how weak it sounded. Then my father made his last mistake. He pointed at me and said, "She poisoned this. She always wanted what wasn't hers." My husband stood up so quietly that it was more effective than yelling. He did not threaten. He did not posture. He just said, "Say that again while her daughter can hear you." Lucy was in the den with a coloring book, but the doorway was open. That shut my father up. I took one page from the folder and slid it across the table toward him. It was a letter from the attorney, prepared that afternoon but not yet sent, summarizing the legal position and demanding preservation of records in anticipation of claims if harassment, interference, or contest attempts continued. You have 2 choices, I said. You leave Grandma alone, stop contacting facilities, stop threatening litigation, and provide a full accounting of the money you took. Or our attorney files. My mother whispered, "Files what?" I answered her plainly. Everything available. No one touched their food again. We left before dessert. My grandmother did not ask permission. She stood, thanked my aunt for the sweet potatoes because she had actually liked them, told Lucy to put on her sweater, and walked out of her daughter's house with more dignity than anyone else in it. The aftermath was not dramatic. Real consequences rarely are. My father hired a lawyer first. Then, after his lawyer reviewed the trust documents, the capacity records, the property filings, and the financial ledger, his tone changed. Not morally. Strategically. There would be no trust contest. No challenge to my authority. No further attempts to place my grandmother anywhere without my written approval. My brother, through counsel, produced partial repayment records that covered a fraction of what he had taken. The rest he agreed to settle over time rather than have the accounting dragged through civil court. My mother and father did the same, though only after enough pressure that their lawyer likely billed them for every ounce of denial. The settlement did not make us rich. It was not cinematic. It did something better. It corrected the lie. Funds were repaid into the trust and designated for my grandmother's care exactly the way my grandfather intended. We used some of it to hire a licensed home aide 3 afternoons a week so I could work without panic and my husband could breathe a little easier. We widened the bathroom doorway, replaced the broken truck transmission without putting it on a credit card, fixed the drawer in the kitchen, though not the way my husband wanted, because at that point it had become family history. My father stopped calling. My mother sent 2 cards over the next year, both written as if distance had simply happened to all of us like weather. I did not answer. My brother texted once on Christmas. I sent back a photo of Lucy and my grandmother playing checkers. Nothing more. My grandmother stayed with us for another 19 months. They were not easy months. Aging rarely is. There were falls that could have been worse, medication changes, one frightening night in the ER, and long afternoons where she missed my grandfather so deeply it seemed to hollow the room. But she was never put somewhere against her will. She sat in our kitchen every morning with tea and toast and watched Lucy leave for school. She told stories I had never heard before about my grandfather as a young man, stubborn and laughing and impossible. She outlived the version of her own children that she had protected in public for decades. I think that hurt her. I also think truth gave her some peace. When she died, it was in our house, with music low in the den and Lucy asleep down the hall and my hand in hers. Her last clear words to me were, "He chose right." For a long time after, I wondered whether I had done enough, or too much, or whether there had been some cleaner way through it all. Age has made that question simpler. Some families call removal care. Some call greed practicality. Some call silence peace. My grandfather left me documents because he knew love without structure gets overrun by people who mistake access for entitlement. He was right. Paper did matter. It stopped what feelings alone never would have stopped. But that was not the real inheritance. The real inheritance was much smaller and much harder to fake. A child giving up her room without being asked. A man installing grab bars before sunrise and never calling himself generous. 2 old people being treated like they still belonged to the world, not like they were waiting to be managed out of it. That was what my parents never understood. The house was never the asset. The money was never the center. The center was whether a person remained a person when they became inconvenient. My grandmother did. And so did I.